we've seen how Arthur Cecil Pigou provided a solution to the problem of externalities. That is, to impose a tax, for example, on a negative externality of production. You impose a tax equal to the size of the external cost imposed on others, on bystanders who are external to the market. In that way, the producers will alter their behaviour such that they will produce the socially optimal output. In the 1960s, however, this conventional wisdom was, in a sense, turned on its head by an economist who was trained in the law, an economist named Ronald Coase. In an article in 1960 entitled "The Problem of Social Cost," there we are, Coase argued that the following was true. We really need to think in terms of what he called the reciprocal problem of externalities. He writes, "The traditional approach has tended to obscure the nature of the choice that has to be made when we come to the question of externalities. The question is commonly thought of as one in which A inflicts harm on B, and what has to be decided is, how should we restrain A? But this is wrong. We are dealing with a problem of a reciprocal nature. To avoid the harm to B would be to inflict harm on A. The real question that has to be decided is, should A be allowed to harm B, or should B be allowed to harm A? The problem is to avoid the more serious harm." And he goes on to give an example where he talks about a confectionery business which is located next door to a dentist. And he says that the confectionery business makes a lot of noise and it is disturbing to the dentist, so that the dentist has less trade than they otherwise would have. Now, from the perspective of Pigou, you would say, well, it's easy to identify the culprit in this case. We put a tax on the confectionery business because it has an external negative effect on the dentist. But Pigou says it's not so clear as that. It's a little bit ambiguous. I mean, on the one hand, if we tax the confectionery business, the dentist gains, the confectionery business loses. On the other hand, if we don't tax the confectionery business wins and the dentist loses. I mean, either way, you're going to get a loser out of this and you're going to get a winner by the imposition of this tax. So he's asking, well, where should it really be? It shouldn't just be decided on the basis of some kind of intuition about one guy being the bad guy who is inflicting harm on the victim. He says we need to think of it in a different way. He suggests that the underlying problem here is really, well, I'm putting a spin on this, the underlying problem here is that there is a common resource. That is to say that there are no rights clearly defined and allocated over the use of, for example, the air, or rights over noise, for example. So Coase comes up with an intriguing kind of solution to this problem that doesn't involve government. At least it involves government in the most minimal kind of way. And it would go something like this. If we can allocate private property rights, which can be enforced, over the previously common resource, for example, the air, or the airspace, then we could simply allow the two parties to trade with each other over the rights to the air or the airspace or whatever or the river or whatever the common resource is. And they would be able to come up with, by freely exchanging, an optimal outcome. At least a potentially better outcome than if we simply, in a knee-jerk fashion, impose a tax on who seems to be the culprit. The condition here is, however, that that trade and the enforcement of that trade should involve very low transaction costs. If it's very expensive to engage in trade over rights, then it's likely that the trade will never occur in the first place, in which case you won't get an optimal outcome by this method. But let's see with just an example of how this would work. Let's imagine the following scenario. A factory wants to dump waste into a river. The river is our common resource. At this point in time, no one owns the river. Anyone can use it. Further downstream, there is a trout farm that also wants to use the river. So we have conflicting uses over the river. It's rivalrous. The factory makes $100 profit when it's polluting, and it loses $100 if it's not polluting. Let's also say that the trout farm loses $80 if there is pollution, and it loses $80. Sorry, it makes $80 extra profit if there's no pollution. Let's further say there's a piece of filtration technology available that filters the water, that extracts the pollution from the water and makes it clean, and that filtration technology costs $70. Now, Coase's solution to this problem is not to impose a tax on the factory to the value of the externality it imposes on others. What's the externality, the external value that it imposes? Well, it imposes the trout farm would lose $80 profit due to pollution. So according to Coase, you would impose a tax of $80 on the factory. But Coase says no. What we'll do is we will assign property rights over the river to one of the parties, and then we can simply let them bargain. Let's suppose that the ownership of the river is given to the factory. You might say, well, that's not very fair, but let's say that's what happens. The government does that, or it can be a court decides to award ownership to the factory. Now, the trout farm has two options at its disposal when faced with this situation. Either it can buy filtration technology for itself, which will cost it $70. In that case, its profits will be $10. Because with the filtration technology, it doesn't have to worry about the pollution. So it would make $80 profit, but it had to buy the filtration technology in order to filter the water. So that's $80 minus the $70 for the technology, leaving it with $10 profit. So that's one option. The other option is to purchase the river rights from the factory to the value of the factory's minimum willingness to accept price. That is, you can put the trout farm puts a proposal to the factory and says, look, we'll buy the rights of the river off you. The factory owner says, well, I'm not interested in selling my rights to the river because then I won't be able to pollute the river anymore and I'll lose $100 profit. The trout farm could conceivably say, okay, we will compensate you to the value of the $100 profit you lost. Now, that's obviously not a serious option for the trout farm, because if it bought the rights to the river for $100, it would be able to make $80 profit, because the river, well, theoretically, it would be able to make nominally $80 profit because the river is no longer polluted, but it had to pay $100 compensation to the factory in order to do it, which means it would end up making a loss of $20. So that's not really an option for it. As you can see, what would happen in that case is the trout farm would have to buy the filtration technology for itself and settle for a profit of $80. The factory would continue to own the resource, that is, would continue to own the river. The trout farm would buy filtration technology. That would be the outcome in this case. But let's reverse ownership. Let's say instead that the state or the courts gave ownership of the river to the trout farm. What would happen in that case? Well, now it's the firm's turn to think about what it should do. On the one hand, it could, for example, simply close down, in which case it would lose $100 profit. So its new profits would be zero. Its total profit would be zero from that option. Alternatively, it could purchase the river rights from the farm. Now, how much would the factory be willing to offer to the trout farm in exchange for the river rights? Well, if the factory did gain control over the river, it could pollute the river to make profit. But the farm is not willing to let that occur unless the farm is compensated. Now, what's the minimum amount the trout farm would need as compensation? Well, the minimum amount it would need as compensation, if the river is now going to be polluted, is the price of the filtration technology. It would need a minimum of $70 compensation if we were to give up the rights to the river. On the other hand, the factory would be willing to offer no more than $99. If it offered $100, it would make no profit. There's no difference between offering $100 to the trout farm for the rights to the river and just closing down. So it offers, say, a maximum of $99. So somewhere in between there, they could haggle and higgle away and come to some price. What we do know is that the new profits of the factory will be between $30, that is $100 profit minus having to pay $70 to the trout farm to gain control of the river, and $1, that is paying $99 to the trout farm as compensation for the rights to the river. So its new profits will be anywhere between $30 and $1. Now, which of those two options would the factory prefer? Well, it would prefer option 2, because it could make between $30 and $1 and $30 versus 0. So between $1 and $30 is clearly a better option. So what ends up being the result? The result is, and this is the slightly interesting thing, is exactly the same as before. Again, we end up in a situation where the factory owns the rights to the river, and the trout farm ends up purchasing the filtration technology. Just the same result as when ownership was granted to the factory in the first place. So we can see here, Coase's kind of solution to this problem is, as long as you define the property rights and allow people to engage in free trade over those property rights, you'll end up with an optimal outcome. It doesn't matter who is initially allocated the rights.